Hello and welcome to the Hello I'm Grieving podcast. I am your host, Dr. Julie Shaw, founder of the Hello I'm Grieving community, where we focus on acknowledging and dealing with grief to live a full life. Our tagline, Say Hello to Grief, emphasizes the importance of mindfully and courageously acknowledging while also engaging with our grief so we can find hope, lessons, motivation, and healing in the midst of our pain. Today, we have the opportunity to say hello to Isabel Knight. Isabel Knight is the founder of the Death Designer, which provides end-of-life planning services, including funeral and vigil planning, digital account password management, advanced directives, and assistance with reconciling fears of mortality. She takes a human-centered design approach with a focus on promoting individual autonomy, sustainability, and home death care options. Isabel's goal is to create a more humane and equitable end-of-life experience for all. She is also the president of the National Home Funeral Alliance, a board member of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Pennsylvania, and the program director for the Jewish Association for Death Education. She helps doulas and death-positive businesses create a more inclusive and accessible experience for their clients through human-centered design workshops, and also creates online courses and offers a freelance graphic design work. You can find her on Instagram at the Death Designer. So let's all say hello to Isabel. So Isabel, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Awesome. So I was just telling you before that we've had our conversations in the past. We've been a part of the Pause program together, which I've mentioned in prior episodes in interviewing some of our cohort members who are doing tremendous things in the death and grief space. But I still, I'm just like, I have so many questions for you and to really see, what do you do? Because I feel like you do so much in this space. And especially for me, the work that you do just in the funeral space and the things you're advocating for and the policy changes that you're working on. Would love for people to learn alongside me as we're going through this podcast today. And if you could tell us more about that work that you do in the funeral space.
Yeah, totally. So basically, I have my business, which focuses on doing the workshops and the trainings and whatnot for other death care businesses and nonprofits, and then I have the nonprofit. And the National Home Funeral Alliance is an organization that lets people know that they can do funerals at home and educates people on how to do that specifically. So we just published a guidebook this year, for example, that we published back in May that was talking about how do you wash a body? Like, what's the checklist, basically, to do a funeral at home? What paperwork do you need to get? How do you handle transportation? Do you need a funeral director in your state to deal with any of those? There's like 9 states, basically, that requires a funeral director at some point in the process. And so we're in a really exciting time as an organization on that side, purely because now that we've finished this book and are promoting the book, like, we can now have an opportunity to like think about what are some of the next steps we want to take, whether it's like focusing more on state level advocacy, or whether we want to continue to put out other educational materials. So that's like a really exciting sort of transition point that we're in right now, because we had like half of our board turnover this month.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm planning right now a retreat for our organization to all like go to St. Louis and hash out like, okay, here are the, root causes of some of what's preventing people from being able to do community death care. And, how do we address that? And I have a sort of a quarterly meeting of other death care nonprofits that includes like the Green Burial Council, the Order of the Good Death, the Funeral Consumers Alliance, et cetera, et cetera. And we're currently in the process of trying to figure out, how can we support each other, because there's so much overlap in the work that we're doing as well. But the biggest thing that I've been focused on in recent history has been this basically FTC funeral rule stuff. So
And Kate, I'm
basically,
I'm probably going to stop you and ask you a lot of questions.
oh, please,
So
yeah, go ahead.
FTC, can you
Yeah,
explain for our listeners what FTC is?
of course. So the FTC is the Federal Trade Commission, and it is the agency that regulates, amongst many other industries, the funeral industry.
Okay.
And so they have basically one main regulation called the funeral rule that covers everything in the funeral space, and it has sort of, in its current format, it includes like 10 basic rights that consumers have, and it includes things like, being offered a price list once they go, to shop in person, or being able to bring in an outside casket from an outside vendor without being charged something that the industry used to call an uncorking fee, for example.
Huh.
So, things like that, where it's just the basic consumer protections. And this is currently, like this year, is the first time, I think in my lifetime, that they have actually, reevaluated that regulation. I believe, there's some sort of cadence where you're supposed to like reevaluate these laws within the FTC every 10 years. And the Funeral Consumers Alliance has really been pushing hard to get them to look at this particular law,
The
specifically
particular
around
law
the funeral rule.
of the funeral
Yeah.
rule in
Yeah.
its all capacity. Okay.
Yeah, the main thing that they're looking at right now is whether or not they should require funeral homes to post prices online and mandate it. There's only one state in the US that requires that right now, and it's California.
California.
And yeah.
Proud to live.
Yeah.
That's why we pay so much to live here. That's what we say.
Right. And so I would love to see that, become a federal mandate. And there's some other things that they're reevaluating as well, such as whether or not they should amend some of the disclosures, for example. Right now they're looking specifically at the embalming disclosure to see if they can write it in such a way that can make it more clear to people that like it's not required by law to embalm. It's usually only a funeral home policy to embalm. And so, if they don't want to embalm, they could seek out another funeral home, for example. But the way it's written now, it seems like it's required by law under certain circumstances.
So you're saying people have a choice. Like there are these choices that people have, but it's that disclosure that is it the funeral homes that can choose to disclose or not, or is it up to the consumer or the people that are going there to seek out these services, that they kind of need to know their rights? They need to know what can be disclosed, what can't be.
Basically, the way it works is that the embalming disclosure is mandated for everyone, and often the funeral homes themselves have a policy internally that, for example, if you want to do an open casket viewing, you need to embalm. However, the disclosure is trying to tell you that that's not mandated by law. That's just mandated by the funeral home, right? But it's not worded very clearly, so that's like something that causes a lot of confusion for consumers.
Yeah.
So it's basically a lot of nitty gritty things like that, where like you can get really in the weeds around like what should be a disclosure. So the FTC held a workshop at the beginning of September. And it was attended by both, funeral consumer advocates and industry professionals. And what we talked about was basically like talking through what are the pros and cons of all of these considered amendments that the FTC had proposed. And it was a really, really interesting event. Like a lot of the people who are kind of in the funeral home space, I've heard reference to it as like the Super Bowl of the funeral industry, right?
This
like
is where
everyone
you go to talk all things funerals,
because this was like sort of what I consider to be a pretty once in a lifetime event to be able to really change this regulation, right? Because like they're so busy regulating all of these other industries that this is gonna be our opportunity to really nail the point home. Then like we should really take that opportunity. So one of the things that I advocated for in that forum was advocating for just literally having disclosures for all of the elements of the funeral rule, because in my mind that's kind of what a disclosure is for, is to let you know what your rights are.
Yeah, absolutely.
And why stop at embalming? Like why not let people know all of these other rights? Because there are organizations that are trying to educate people about their funeral consumer rights, for example, like the Funeral Consumers Alliance, but there's just they're not gonna have the same reach as just mandating it to happen, at the time when the consumers actually need that information, which is when they're actually going to a funeral home, buying a funeral.
Exactly.
Right?
I think like this speaks to, what I'm trying to do, obviously personally, is learn more about this. But I feel like you're giving so much knowledge and resources to folks because when we can look back through our own experiences, and if people listening, or maybe they're listening for somebody else to help them through a death, right? Is that we are so consumed with our own grief at that moment.
Right.
I'm pretty sure disclosures aren't at the top of our mind.
Hmm.
And I mean, this probably works into some of the other work that you do with the end of life planning, is
Hmm.
how can you inform people to plan ahead, and that they know their rights, they know their options, they know their choices. Can you give, me and the listeners maybe a couple more examples of some things that, hey, these are some things that we should take a look at, and these are some things that we should know, planning funerals, or if we haven't planned it, maybe just maybe we're going to have a little bit of that memory with us to be able to advocate for ourselves, because it really sounds like that. It's like, how can we advocate for ourselves? How can we advocate for our loved ones, family, and friends during this time that can be a very, very challenging time for us?
Right. I mean, it's funny because when you talk to people, especially after the fact, who are in grief, who have gone through either, the death of a parent or someone that they know, often the things that come up are things that really wouldn't necessarily have thought to think about, right? So,
Hmm.
for example, a friend of mine, who was actually on my podcast recently, Kimaya, she was talking about how she was basically like knew that her mom was dying for many many years, and the one of the things that she brought up was like her mom had this storage unit that
Hmm.
they had stored a lot of very treasured items to their family in, and no one had she had not told anyone like literally where the storage unit was or like how to contact them to continue paying for their storage unit, and no one, I guess, thought to ask that question, so it was just they lost a lot of those really
Items.
special items.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's thinking of things like that, which isn't something that might normally fall under sort of like a typical end of life planning sort of checklist,
Hmm.
but they can be so impactful, especially when, you're grieving, right? I mean, it's interesting because it also ties into some of what our colleague Charlene does when she talks about curating particular she has a company called the Grief Gallery, and that's all about curating some of the items from the people that you've lost and talking about what they mean to you. And so, all of it is really intertwined. And so a lot of what I'm doing is trying to, I think something that is very common to all of us who work in death care is just trying to move the conversation upstream, right? Because
Yeah.
we know it's going to have all of these downstream effects in terms of how you can process the death, how are able to handle just in the immediate aftermath of a death, like how to get through the logistics if you haven't done some of that planning. Like it all compounds upon each other,
For
right? And
sure.
usually it comes down to what would have been maybe like a 5 minute conversation. Like they could have easily been like, oh yeah, like can you just tell us where the storage unit is,
Yeah.
right? And another one is passwords is a huge, it comes up for so many people, right? They're literally just like, I need to shut off the gas in my parents' house and I need the password to their gas account, you know?
Mhm. Mhm.
So a lot of it is just
How
really
are you
basic things
able
like that.
to I guess is that more so in the planning, or is it, do you help people like actually find those things, or navigate like how they can
Yeah.
find those things?
I mainly do that in like sort of the planning phases, and then basically the way I structure my service is that I have sort of like a set package of sessions for people where I'll go through like the paperwork stuff, like the advance directive. I'll go through the legacy stuff, like what particular items are you leaving behind, and like do you want people to read your journal, like et cetera. And then we have like a password session, for example. And then if people want a lot more hands-on help for me to like go and like look at all your sticky notes with all your passwords on it and help you put it in password manager, I can like have that sort of be an add-on.
Oh,
So that's
nice.
kind of how I
Nice.
structure it.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And then so I guess, are you also walking people through, obviously taking them through the funeral planning as well? And I'm sure
Right.
there's lots of planning that goes into that. What do you think, like in your experience, has been the most beneficial thing for folks to know about the funeral planning piece?
Well, something that comes up very frequently for the people who are obviously there's kind of multiple camps of people depending on how kind of death phobic you are, right? Or like There are some people who are really just trying to get the bare minimum done because they really don't want to be having the conversation. And then there's some people who are really excited about it and they're really gung ho about, planning this event, because so many people say to me, like, funeral planning must be so morbid, like you're constantly talking with people about, topics they don't want to talk about. And I'm like, actually, planning is really just like you're thinking about your favorite music, like all of your friends, your favorite foods. Like, it's just like as fun as planning any other party. Like, one thing that I say to people is it's pretty much like planning a wedding, but you often take years to plan a wedding and you're not grieving, right? So that
Wow,
is
yeah.
sort of the highlight of the importance of why, you know, it's just so helpful to start years in advance and regularly update your plan and revisit it, because, you move states and suddenly you're working with a whole different set of laws, right?
Isn't isn't that so interesting? Like, you just made me think about that, right? Like, I've often thought about, wedding planning, funeral planning, but even how you just said it right there, to where it's like people will spend years and they'll invest all this time and money into planning for their wedding, right?
Mhm.
Um and even how challenging that can be to plan a wedding. And I was even taking it a step further in my thought as you were talking and thinking about, some people will plan a wedding before they even have found a partner. And some people, the truth is, some people may think about their wedding and imagine it, and maybe they do not find a partner, right?
Mhm.
And so, but death is absolutely going to be guaranteed. And
Mhm.
so it's like, how come we aren't taught that as well? As much as we give this whole fairy tale to what weddings are, that why aren't we also planning for another big life celebration, right? Because we can look at weddings as another life transition. We could look at it as another life change, another life celebration, which is another way that we can also look at death. Um,
Totally.
but we have these two different opinions and visuals of that, and feels, right? Sure, it might be scary. They talk about cold feet, like getting married.
Mhm.
But yeah, there is that fear that people can block out that planning because it forces them to actually think about their own mortality.
Right. And that's a lot of why I also tell people to do it as early as possible, because you talk to people my age and they don't have any problem talking about death because it doesn't feel like this emergency thing like lurking
Mm,
over your shoulder in the same way it might if you're like 75, right?
yeah,
And so just getting people to have the conversation in that, more just as ideal of a context as possible, can make the whole conversation so much more relaxed because you're not doing it as an emergency, right? Because
yeah.
then it can get so tense. Like, once you're, in that space where you're like, oh my God, like we have to get this done. Like, this is our last opportunity. That's like the, honestly, like, the worst time to do it.
Yeah,
Right? But I mean,
yeah,
obviously it's got to get done at some point. So, that's often what's going on. But that's why it's like, so important to try to, like, get people to think about it at earlier milestones in their life, right? Like, when you first, like, for example, when your kid first becomes an adult and, you're like trying to think about, like, okay, what are some of the things that we need to think about what as it relates to that transition. Like, as soon as you get a bank account, like, you should have a will, you should have a beneficiary assigned to your accounts and things like that, right?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, these are things that I'm thinking about right now, and trying to figure that out, or even just, as a new mom, trying to figure out, okay, who will be responsible for our child,
Hmm.
in the case that both my wife and I die, right?
Right.
And thinking about all those responsibilities, and what would that include? Like,
Right.
what would that include? Would there be any stipulations financially on how we would support our child in death, and also uh provide for the people that are taking care of her, right?
Right.
And so it's having all these different decisions, and sometimes those decisions can be very daunting, I guess. How do you then help people and coach people through those decisions, and kind of lay out all these decisions in front of them without making it so daunting for them?
Well, okay, one of the things that I try to do is to try to just make it seem really like something that is a very routine, commonplace thing to do, right? Where it's not like this is the end all be all. You can obviously always change your funeral plan or your end of life plan, right? And in fact, it should be something that you do routinely. It's like going to the dentist,
Yeah.
And
And
so
that's so
once
hard for people to do.
right, exactly, exactly. So I think that like, once you start conceiving of it as something that's less of a like, oh, okay, like, this is like sort of my one opportunity to like get
Yeah.
everything out. I think that can it's all about like just trying to lower the stakes a little bit. You
Yeah.
know?
Mhm.
And so one of the things for the people who are really excited about end of life planning, a lot of what comes up is people are like they get really excited about planning the funeral and they're like, "Oh my god, like all my friends are going to be there, like, this is going to be so great." And like one of my clients had this idea to do a photo booth slash like letter writing booth where
Uh-huh.
she wants to do like a celebration of life while she's alive, and she
Oh.
was like, oh, I would love there to be like an open mic, but if there's things that people want to tell me that they don't want to say in public necessarily, then they can like go into this little photo booth and they can like either write me a letter or they can record a video of themselves, like you can have a computer open. And she was like, as she was thinking through it, she was like, I would love to have those videos, earlier rather than later, honestly, right? Because it
Yeah.
addresses that. Like, I feel like often when people go to funerals, they're like, oh, I really wish that this person had heard this while they were alive, right? Because
Yeah.
especially when someone sort of dies unexpectedly, that's, I think, one of the most common sentiments that you'll hear. And so basically like encouraging people to do this kind of reflection work about like who's important to them, what they want to accomplish, all throughout their life. That's been something that for myself, I next year I'm turning 30 and I'm going to have like a huge 30th birthday party that's going to be like a celebration of friendship, and I'm going to invite all of
Mhm.
my friends, and it's going to be like a wedding level party because I'm like not planning on ever having a wedding. So for
Okay.
me,
Yeah.
I'm like, how can we sort of queer these institutions in a way that also I think is informed by like kind of your mortality, and like the fact that I think about death all the time, I think allows me to live such a richer life. And
Mhm.
I also feel that the people that I work with, like I totally get that feeling about other death care people, is that I really like love all the people that I work with because it really feels to me like, I have a friend who has an autoresponder. She lives in Hawaii. She's like, if the waves are good, I'm going to be on the beach. So, don't expect a response super quickly, And I
Yeah.
love those people because I think it just, you know, is just a very wise sort of perspective to take on how to live,
Yeah.
in a deep, fulfilling way.
Yeah. I mean, grief teaches us so much, right? I think
Right.
it can be one of life's greatest teachers. And I I mean, I'm wondering, what is your grief? How have you been able to, and I always say this, how have you been able to say hello to your own grief while also helping others say hello to theirs
Yeah.
and carry the space for both?
Yeah. Well, one thing that is, there's a lot of people I've noticed who work in death care because they have had a really either traumatic death or someone that they knew died at a very young age or was very unexpected. And I don't come to it with that. I really only have had sort of two main people in my lives who have died thus far. And so I do think that some of that maybe, I mean, I have no idea, right? If
Mhm.
it's all speculation, but I do feel as if that maybe that allows me to kind of hold the grief for other people when they come to me. Like I had a grief doula client who,
Mhm.
had whose mother had died like a year before they came to me. And they were just really having quite a difficult time. And I feel like, because I don't have like a lot of that wasn't super triggering for me. It really, which is not to say that like, obviously there's plenty of people who have had loss in their life, which is, absolutely they're not any less able to work through that in the work that they do. But I think that personally it has helped me to really be able to hold that for other people. Because I feel like, in terms of like the grand scheme of like, having some sort of like grief meter,
Mhm.
I feel emotionally at this point in my life like my cup is very full.
Mm.
So, I feel very lucky that that's the case.
Yeah, yeah, because I mean, I'm sure even people listening to you talk, right? And even probably past episodes
Hmm.
as well with other guests is maybe they're even wondering, or again, they could resonate with what you're
Hmm.
saying, but people listening can be at very different stages or I don't want to use the stages, but like places in their grief, right? Or seasons in
Hmm.
their grief, or points in their grief. But it's like you're able to talk about death so
Hmm.
openly, so fluidly. And, what do you think that's like when you're engaging in these death conversations with folks that it might be a little bit more uncomfortable for them, where they're not ready to have these conversations? How do you feel like you approach those and educate them on that?
Yeah. Well, it's something that I'm still like working through for sure. Is how do you figure out the right balance? I think currently what I tend to do is just I never quite push people, beyond their comfort zone. I'm like, if you don't want to talk about this, you don't want to talk about it, and that's totally fine.
Hmm.
And I sometimes wonder if like I should be maybe a little bit more like actually like maybe you really should consider
Mm,
thinking about this. You know what I
hmm.
mean?
Hmm.
Um, but that's kind of just something that is kind of a delicate balance with each
It is.
relationship and each client. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Um, but it also is really like an interesting dynamic because a lot of the people that I work with are much older than me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of it comes down to like the sort of approach that I have taken to it is a lot more along the lines of like I focus less on like I don't call myself a death doula because I don't really do any bedside vigil stuff, and I think
Okay.
that's a lot of what people
Imagine.
associate
Hmm.
with doula work. Um, but I feel like the place where I can really help you is, a lot of the things that people do rely on, like, sort of like the tech savvy young person in their family for, like the passwords and like, things like that. Um, but I think that it's something that I like am still really learning like how to figure out how to help people engage with, right? One of the things that like I did do a doula training, and one of the things that they talk about is helping people get through like the rugs, the regrets, unfinished business, guilt, and shame, right?
Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it's interesting because it felt like um a lot of it. I mean, basically it's always complete like I never know what people are going to say. Like the only maybe trend is around people's like relationships is like,
And
people
can
who
you
either
repeat those? Were they three things? Can you repeat
the
those again?
regrets, unfinished business, guilt, and shame.
Ah, okay. Big ones.
Yeah,
Yeah.
big
Hmm.
ones. Yeah. um and obviously like it's so open that you can go in so many different directions with those questions, right? They can be like some people have truly, like huge life regrets of like wishing their life had gone in a different direction, and that's the stuff where I think people are really afraid of death. Like yes, there's people who are afraid of pain, and there's people afraid who are not or who are afraid of not existing, but I think that the thing that just obviously my own complete personal opinion is that I think the thing that people are really mourning the most is like the alternate universes that could have existed in their life,
Wow. Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Hmm.
And that's something that anyone can grieve at any time, right?
For sure. For sure. I mean, I think about that even, even as I'm working. And I think that's there's that, I think it was an article or a book that someone wrote, and it's kind of been circulated, right? Like they interviewed or came back to a nursing home where people were on their deathbed, and they talked about like what advice would they give. And yes, they talked about the regrets, and one of them talked about like work, on
Hmm.
like how much time they spent working versus on creating the relationships with the people in their lives.
Right,
And I think about that a lot now. And
right,
in a way, it helps me put things into perspective. Whereas maybe before I would have stressed about so much more work and all these deadlines, and me being an entrepreneur, I mean, there's stress in that
right.
anyways.
And it's
Um,
lonely. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and everything's on you. Like you are the
Hmm.
business.
Right.
And so it does make me think about, okay, like yes, I have this client. Yes, I have a big deliverable coming. How am I prepping? But I think my own grief and understanding mortality more now is also, and also being a new mom is understanding, okay, like when I'm spending time with my daughter, like I want to be
I'm in
focused
it.
on, I'm
Yeah.
in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to be focused on it. And I was actually just talking to my wife about this last night. And I actually told her, I practice the idea of memento mori a lot, which is the comes from Stoicism, and like that Latin phrase of remember we all will die. It kind of translates loosely into that. And I
Mhm.
really, when I first heard that, I loved it. And I actually have it on my screensaver. So
Yeah.
I see it all the time. But one of the practices that does sound kind of very, morbid or kind of like, why would you do that? But I'll still share it. Is when I hold my daughter at night, like when I'm putting her to sleep, is that I will practice memento mori, and I will say, like, if she were to die, like tonight or like right now, in the next like 15 minutes, like after I step out this door, and she goes to bed, like it makes me, and the way I explained it to my wife was like, it makes me hold on a little bit tighter. It makes me feel like the weight of her in my arms a bit more. It makes me capture the memory and the sense, and like all my senses get so
Mhm.
focused that like I feel, okay, like what is it really like to be truly, truly present
Yeah.
and to truly value that time. So
Mhm.
I don't know how we got here, but that's what I'm sharing
I
when it
think
comes
that's
to
literally
that.
the key to
Yeah.
happiness, right? Like we
Mhm.
all like I feel like in all the studies that people do where they're like it's really about doing something that makes you feel really grounded in the present, right? And you're not worrying about something tomorrow or like a deadline and you're not staring at your screen. It's just like how do you really hold on to those moments because it's so hard. Like everything is constantly trying to distract you,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm. Yeah. And I think if anybody listening too, if they are dealing with those regrets that you're talking about and do have the shame or do have, you're going to have to remind me again the other
The
two,
guilt,
guilt
the unfinished business.
and the unfinished business. Like if you are experiencing those things, I think, and maybe you can't see it yet. Maybe it is something you're toying with if you're listening to this or watching this, but it's understanding that those can be the gifts of grief. That like, what are
Hmm.
you doing going forward, and how can you like you're saying, Isabel, how can you find that happiness through that lens? Yes, it came through a very sad, very deep, very, it could be tragic for you, like all these moments that this pain that we have, and how can we alchemize that, and how can we change what's next for us,
Hmm.
right? And be very intentional about what is next, and how can we be an active participant in that.
Hmm.
And it is hard for me when I am practicing memento mori, but at the same time it's helping me practice being in that present moment, and really knowing that, I did that, and that has come from the death of my sister and the most favorite person to me, and
Hmm.
and through different pregnancy losses. So it's like, even with that, it's also understanding when I hold my daughter, I'm holding on to so much more now,
Right.
right? And I know
Yeah.
that can be very hard for people listening that maybe have experienced the true loss of a child,
Hmm.
and people grappling with that. So I want to respect that in this moment. And everybody's going to find their own way. And so, just hoping that we can be intentional about what those steps that we take next.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I talk to people about when we do, those conversations around mortality is there's I think it was Ernest Becker who kind of came up with this paradigm, but like one of the things that they say around how you can sort of come to terms with your mortality is like coming up with like sort of a narrative, a coherent narrative around your life. Like if you don't feel as if you have that narrative, I feel like that is or that's, or at least according to him, what a lot of the root is of people who have this like fear of death is like they don't like carry out sort of like this story that they see themselves as being the protagonist of. And
Oh.
like the hero's journey that
Yeah,
people
yeah,
talk
yeah.
about. Like, yeah, it's like what is the hero, trying to do in this,
Yeah.
like, and how do you like conceive of your life in such a way that you can live your life and then feel as if you kind of like tied this neat bow on, like, oh, I
Mhm.
accomplished the goal that I kind of set out to accomplish.
Yeah.
And that is obviously such a loaded question for
It's
people,
heavy.
right? It's really heavy.
Yeah.
So I feel super super grateful that, on the one hand, like when we talk about identity stuff, for example, right? We were both, for example, in a business residency that's focused on people of color. One of the things that I often say is that, like, the number one sort of identity that resonates most with me is actually just sort of being a millennial, and like having that generational identity, because it does, I really do think that a lot of people in my generation, a lot of Gen Z people, are really questioning a lot of those sort of status quo assumptions about what you're supposed to do with your life, and like the 40-hour work week and getting married and like following the script, right? And I feel like that is even more like validated when I talk to people at end of life, and they are sort of like going through that realization that like they didn't really want the script, right?
Wow. I mean, that's big, right?
Yeah.
Because we are taught this whole ideal of
Yeah.
how it's supposed to be, and a lot of us really do try to follow that script.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so I think that's like the root of a lot of grief that happens, right? Like when someone dies, there's sort of like, I and this is maybe kind of like a lot, but like I feel as if there's like usually like this sense that you have with people who you're close to, right, when they die, that they either like died receiving more than they deserved, or giving more and like they never received as much as they deserved to get back
Hmm.
in return.
Yeah.
And
That's
like
deep
that,
too.
I don't even know where to start from, like, a I don't know how grief counselors like do that when they're like, how do you literally handle those really deep sadnesses that could come with that, because I
Yeah.
feel like that's just a truism of the universe.
Yeah. And I think a lot of these things, I love getting deep here too,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I want other people to be thinking about this and spark other
right.
conversations. But
Hmm.
it is also kind of interesting because I feel like, and even as you're talking about generationally,
Hmm.
right, is that I do feel like generations, ages, as we age, like that will change. It will
Yeah,
change because even as I'm aging, I'm starting to recognize, okay, what is it that I truly value?
yeah,
What is it that I truly, want to have in my life? Who I want to have in my life, what types of relationships. Those things become a lot more evident.
yeah.
And those are, again, we have to learn those through our own lived experiences, and everybody's lived experience is going to be the same. And just like I've said before, like you're the director of your own life, you're the director of your own stories, is to not subscribe to what society feels like you should do or be.
Hmm.
And that can be challenging for folks as well to live authentically. And I think for me, and who knows, all of us, maybe we truly won't know until we are on our deathbed ourselves,
Right.
right? And that's something else you have to wrestle with if we're talking about this deeply is, again, we can plan and plan and plan, but maybe once we get there, like that's maybe when things click. If we're fortunate enough to have the death that we have planned.
Yeah.
And that's another big thing too, but I also think it's very important to do the work like you're talking about is to start that planning ahead.
Hmm.
So at least, you know, it can take some of that's what I find the value in end of life planning is it can take a lot more of the pressure off of you, off of family members, off of whoever is supporting you and caring for you, and let you have just a little bit more of that time back, right?
Hmm.
To where you aren't concerned about these things and okay, we've already taken care of this, so now I can invest time where it needs to be. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, it just takes you a little bit out of that like deep pit of chaos that happens afterwards, because like, you have this overwhelming sense of like, I don't even know what I don't know. So like it could be an infinite pit of like things that I need to do that I don't even understand. Like people have to go through probate court, people have to like, there's just so many of these things. And so it's such a gift to the people who are handling that for you.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
like how you frame that. It is a gift. It is a
Yeah.
gift because I think about people who have to maybe handle all of this by themselves. I know I've felt that way with my sister's death, being able to take on a lot of the paperwork and
Hmm.
she didn't have any of this planning.
Right.
So, I kind of took that role and kind of owned that, but it was still very lonely and it is still very hard to kind of piece everything together when you don't have all these answers and filtering through storage boxes and people find new paperwork and you're like, what can I do with this?
Yeah.
And again, also reconciling with the fact that maybe that puzzle you've been trying to put together may not be solved. And again, how can you still support the people that need to be supported and have those answers?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I actually do want to
Absolutely.
switch to because when you are talking about this planning, I know that you talk about home funerals and
Mhm.
when it goes back to, what are people's rights? And I would love for you to kind of walk us through and walk me through that because I know culturally there can be planning around having a funeral in home, but maybe I'm thinking about this in a completely different way. So can you educate me and those listening about like home funerals and what goes
What do you
into
mean by
that?
culturally?
Like I will say like me being half Filipino, I know that when my grandmother died, I went back to the Philippines, and it's customary for them to have the body there in the house and to be viewed. And people from our village and people from all over can come and sit. I think you also see this in the Jewish community with kind of sitting Shiva, and
Mhm.
hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Mhm.
But understanding that there are cultural factors that, like, maybe certain cultures are like, yeah, we've been doing this. Like, this
Yeah.
is this is something we already know about. But what would you say a home funeral looks like? How creative can people be? What are the rules and regulations, and how do
Mhm.
people like do that?
Yeah, yeah, totally. Okay, I see what we're talking about now, because I feel as if like, it's hard to like run an organization where you're advocating for this thing, but the thing itself like looks so different for different people, right? We used to do, funerals at home, and then the Civil War happened and they were, bringing soldiers back from war, so like this kind of created this professionalism around embalming so that they could bring them back for viewings, and then out of that came this whole industry basically of funeral directing and seeing it, especially like they talk about like, there's a masculinization as there's a professionalization. Like it used to be something that was considered work that women did, and like, then it became much more of a clinicalized and like medicalized process to people, and then it started to be regulated, and so a lot of people talk about it as if it's this narrative of like going back to like, this better, more caring, less sort of corporate way of commemorating someone. And obviously there's so many ways to complicate that narrative, right? Like, a lot of the times pre-Civil War, the people who were doing the home funerals were not necessarily the families themselves, but like slaves. And then in black communities today, for example, like there, especially if people die from gun violence, for example, like it is hard to have like an anti-embalming. Like there's definitely people within the home funeral movement who are really all about, like, there's a strong overlap between people who are into green burial and like the environmental sustainability side of that. But then there's obviously these conversations around, okay, but like, is that inclusive if, for example, like people do need some kind of reconstruction and
For
die
sure.
through violent means and have a traumatic death,
Yeah.
right? So obviously there's like all of these, and there's no like perfect way to address all of it. But really the through line is that, most people in this country would like to die at home, right?
Ah,
And
okay. Hmm.
I, and n- not nearly as many people ever actually get to do that. There's so many people who are dying in a hospital, and so one of the obstacles, for example, to actually pragmatically getting people to be able to do home funerals is looking at like hospitals' body release policies, right? Are they going to like release back to a family, or are they going to require a funeral director, for example? And so there's just so many advocacy areas in which we have so much work to do, basically. But yeah, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. You have someone at home,
Hmm.
and you can choose to wash and shroud the body and have whatever kind of celebration or ritual that you would like. In many states, there are requirements around how much time a body can remain at home without some sort of preservation, which usually means either refrigeration, embalming, or keeping them on ice. So the most typical way for people to sort of preserve the body when they stay at home is by getting ice. And so our guidebook that we put out teaches you all about how to do that. But there's plenty of people who find that to be a really just having the space to kind of breathe and not feel as if you have to call 911 as soon as someone dies, and just really sit with it can really help. In Many people have said that this really helps them with the grieving process, being able to just take the time to like
Wow.
process
Yeah.
and wash a body and do whatever kind of rituals they need to do. And it's not always like, we also frame it often as like this very loving, caring thing to do for someone. um but there's also plenty of people who are like, I just need to scream at this person too. Like there's so many different, there's complicated grief,
No, thank
and
you for bringing that into the conversation. No, thank you so
yeah.
much for saying that, right? And I think it goes back to, you know,
And you're not going to do that in the hospital in front of all these hospital staff, right?
maybe.
Well, sometimes I'm sure they've seen everything. I'm sure they've seen
Yeah.
everything. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm learning from you, right? Is because that's probably something I've never thought about before.
Right.
I've never thought about how, and you're also talking about it in the sense of, and the way that I'm seeing this is like maybe if somebody's on hospice, or is this like somebody dies of natural causes, they die in their sleep or something like that at home. But then you're talking about like the right to like keep that body there for a certain amount of time, or to preserve
Right.
it for a certain amount of
Right.
time.
And there are even people who will, get their person back from the medical examiner, even in cases where, it wasn't necessarily a medicalized death where someone is dying of cancer or, is in the hospital dying for a long time. There are absolutely cases where people, like, this was one thing that we were actually really trying to think through deeply when we were writing this manual, because there's a lot of funeral directors on our board who like know how to teach people how to do this, even in like cases of burn victims. And then it's like, how far do we want to go in terms of like giving people the permission to do this thing that they want to do, but
Yeah,
also obviously we don't want to like traumatize people, right?
for
In
sure.
cases where it might be really gruesome, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So like that was something that we had to think through a lot.
Yeah, I bet people are gonna have so many questions about this
Yeah.
after the podcast,
Right.
because I feel like I have so many questions. And like I said, I was looking forward to this because I know that there's so much to like learn, and to give people the access to this knowledge, and to give people the access to like choices, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I think we think about death as someone dies, like you said, they go to the mortuary, and we have a funeral, maybe in a religious venue, maybe not. And then they either get buried or cremated. And sometimes we think those are our choices too. And we're also making very quick decisions, especially if it is a sudden death, or if we did not have the planning because of our state of mind, and probably other outside external factors like family, friends pressuring to do different things.
Right.
But I guess that also segues me into sustainability, because I
Mm-hmm.
know I've been seeing new things. I mean, I was watching Shark Tank the other day, and they actually had a pitch for a more sustainable burial.
Mhm.
and how you're able to keep the body, and it's kind of like a natural composting, I would say, like the human composting.
Mhm.
But then they turn the body then into like wood chips, and so
Mhm.
either people or soil, and they
Mhm.
can take that soil, or wood chips, whatever form they were talking about, and that they could then either take that back to their place or residence or wherever, or they had a piece of land that that company would then they could spread the soil there, which would then allow for new trees and forests to grow. So I'm wondering, what insight do you have on the sustainability movement in the death
Mhm.
space?
Right. Yeah, especially like as we were going through this process of building out this guidebook, like we were trying to come up with all these different like scenarios like that can get really in the weeds. Like for example, if you are do an autopsy and the medical examiner will often return the body with your organs in a viscera bag, which is sealed in the body, and then it's a question of if you want to do a green burial, for example, like who's going to take that bag out because it's not technically a compostable, biodegradable material, things like that,
Ah,
right? There's like so many things like that. And so you can really get in the weeds around it. But one thing that I am really excited to learn a bit more about is we are getting all of these new disposition forms, coming onto the market, whether it's human composting, whether it is, alkaline hydrolysis. Those are the the main ones that are really starting to gain a lot of traction and become legalized in states across the country.
can you
And
summarize the alkaline and
yes,
I?
alkaline hydrolysis is also known as water cremation. And
Oh,
basically, you dissolve someone's body in a chamber that is filled with hot water and lye, which is basically the stuff that's in soap. And so it takes about like I want to say like 3 to 4 hours. And basically, what you get at the end is similar to a flame cremation, you just get bones. And so those bones, when you do a flame cremation, when you get these ashes back, it's basically just the bones that are ground up in a machine that's known as a cremulator. So it's a very similar process. You can also get the ashes back from a water cremation, and usually there's actually a much greater volume of ashes because the flame burns away a lot more bone than the water cremation process, you know, sort of decomposes. So that is something that is legal in many states for pets. Like in Pennsylvania, you can do water cremation for your pets,
interesting.
but we have not legalized that yet in this state for humans. So that's something that is just from a sustainability perspective is supposed to be a lot better. I mean, almost basically everything is better than flame cremation.
Yeah, that's
Like
what I've been learning too about flame
yeah,
cremation, how that can also be detrimental to the environment.
yeah, for sure. So like if you there's like, charts that you can look up that are basically talking through like what is the amount of carbon that's sequestered from each of these different or versus burn from each of these different disposition methods. And cremation is by far at the top. So like cremation is like 540 pounds of CO2 that's emitted into the atmosphere, whereas a green burial will actually sequester 25 pounds of carbon,
Oh,
and natural organic reduction is supposed to sequester 3,086 pounds of carbon. So
mm,
it's like drastically different.
yeah. Yeah,
Basically.
yeah. I mean, these are good things for people to know. So again, goes back to options, goes back to educating yourself.
Hmm.
It's making me rethink cremation because I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get cremated. you
Right.
know?
Well, and it's
And
actually like there's a lot of sort of just myths that are out there because there for a while there are a lot of people who thought that cremation was actually more environmentally friendly.
correct, correct, yeah.
Because it's
Mhm.
it's like hard to really compare something like cremation to traditional burial, for example, because the detrimental impact on the environment is just kind of a different thing. So it's a little bit apples to oranges. Like the issue with burial is just that you're taking up, a lot of space. You're often burying people in metal or hardwood caskets that don't biodegrade. And so it's sort of like there's like a pollution sort of like, are we using up all of these materials that we could be, more sustainable about if you just buried someone in a shroud versus the issue with cremation is just that you're using a lot of fossil fuels you know
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I understand all of that. And now it's also going to be interesting to see how the technology, how the different processes people are going to create, because I
Right.
do think we are becoming a lot more conscious of that and how that then factors into the grease.
And like that's something that a lot of, you know, baby boomers, a lot of, you know, people, just a lot of people in general are just very concerned about what is my environmental impact going to be in life and in death. Right. And so that's something that I encourage everyone to do some research on and like figure out what is the most environmentally friendly way to dispose of your body in your state. Because yeah, cremation is the cheapest option, but it's the worst for the environment. So it's like, you know, there's
Yeah.
obviously these competing
Yeah.
factors of like access
Yep.
and like the there's two green burial cemeteries in the Philadelphia area. One of them costs $14,000 for a plot, and the other one costs $1,400 for a plot. So it's
Hmm.
like a 10x difference. But the thing is, there's obviously so much more demand for the one that's cheaper. So their
Yeah.
cemetery is,
Full.
you know, rapidly filling up,
Yeah.
right? Like it's going to be full in the next 5 to 7 years.
Wow.
So there's a huge, you know, I would love to start a green burial cemetery in the Philadelphia area because like there's going to be a drastic need for an there's really not going to be a super affordable option, you know, once that one cemetery fills up. So that's something that I think is huge. I really am curious around like whether or not I don't feel equipped to be able to say whether or not like natural organic production is going to be truly more environmentally friendly. I think that's probably only going to be true in cities, but regardless, there's a green burial option. Like you can do green burial in every state today. Like you don't have to worry basically about whether or not that's legalized or not. So that's the number one option that I push for people who are most environmentally conscious is just
And
look into
what would
green burial.
define a like green burial? Like, are there
Sure.
different options under a green burial, or is green burial just a one type of thing?
So can I actually, I know that your podcast listeners aren't going to be able to see this, but do you mind if I share my screen?
You can, but what you can do is you can send me that link of whatever you're looking at, if it is
Yeah.
a link, and then I could put that in the podcast notes for everyone.
Okay, cool. So basically, uh, the differences between a traditional burial and a green burial is that often a traditional burial is going to have like a stone headstone or mausoleum, and they also have a liner typically around the actual casket, which is also known as a vault, and those are typically made of concrete. And the reason that they have those is just to help with erosion and basically just to make it easier to like mow the lawn and make sure the cemetery is like aesthetically pleasing. And it's typically deeper. It's typically about 5 to 6 feet underground, and the caskets can be made of like anything that you want. It can be made of hardwood or metal. And in the case of a green burial, usually they push for people to use either a native rock or a plaque, or even not have any marker at all. You can just do GPS coordinates if you're fine with that. And then you have to be buried in something that's biodegradable. So that can look like a shroud, or it can look like a wicker casket, pretty much anything that can break down, basically. It's typically a little bit shallower. It's only about 3 to 4 feet underground because the whole idea of it is that you are encouraging the body to decompose. And
Yeah.
so, like, traditional burial kind of like has this sort of myth around it that like you're hermetically sealing someone in a casket and like they're never going to decompose, but that is like just not the case
Yeah.
basically. So
Yeah.
basically that's why we have a lot of those institutions around a traditional burial, is that it's not basically made to optimize for decomposition. And green burial is basically like the reason why it's 3 to 4 feet underground is because you actually want some interaction with oxygen, because that
And the
encourages
elements,
the
right?
helpful microbes that you need to, yeah, exactly, to
Yeah.
break down the body while still being below the smell barrier, which is basically
Oh,
like you
okay.
don't want animals to like, you know, smell it
For
and like
sure.
dig it up. Yeah.
For sure.
So
Yeah.
yeah, does that kind of explain?
Yes, thank you
Yeah.
for showing that, and I actually think that might show up on the video. So,
Oh,
if
perfect.
people are watching on YouTube and maybe even on Spotify, as there's an option to watch video on there, hopefully
Oh,
people
cool.
can see that. And that was a good description, even how you said it.
Yeah.
Because that also makes me think of, I did see um people, and I think this also factors into the sustainability and choosing your options, is they've taken items from that individual to then create that casket, whether it might be like a family table or a bookshelf, and they've repurposed that wood to then be able to use in that burial,
Yeah,
to
I
be able
love
to
it when
do
people
that.
do that. Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
and so that's, I think, a fantastic idea.
Mhm.
Um, Gosh, okay, so Isabel, you have just so many things that I feel like I've learned, and I'm going to have to research even more. But I really hope that this helps folks out there, and to make them think about death differently, make them think about planning, and that, this can be something that they absolutely seek you out to do. I do want to close with two questions that I've asked everybody. So the first question is, if you were to say hello to someone grieving today, what would you say to them?
I mean, I always just say, "How are you doing?" Like, how what's it like being in your body? So much
Mm,
of it is so embodied. Like, if I can do a quick story, I had this grief doula who was also seeing like a body worker, and the body worker was saying, like, a lot of your grief manifests itself in your lungs. And that was also around the time when this person was, like, having a lot of dreams of their mother. And literally, like, a few days later, they literally were diagnosed with pneumonia. And so, like, they could sort of sense even before,
wow.
like, it was like actually manifesting itself, in a sort of more medically, recognizable
For
way,
sure.
that grief was sort of being stored in that part of their body,
Yeah.
you know?
And I think we discount that sometimes, right? Like we discount, and I think that's why we have to pay attention to our body, because our grief will live in these different places.
Right.
Um,
I had
and
someone else actually on my podcast who was like, her grief was in her hip, and she was about to run the New York Marathon,
okay.
and she was working with a death doula, and she was like, and the death doula was literally like, I want you to like talk to your hip and like come up with like a character basically. And so they came up with this
Wow.
character of like a sumo wrestler, and it seemed like it really actually did alleviate a lot of the pain that she was feeling.
Because it
Yeah.
allows us to then focus on it. And I think
Yeah.
when we're able to focus on that body part, in a
Hmm.
roundabout way, we're focusing on our grief and to be
Yeah.
able to process that. So I love that tip. Dropping more jewels there for us. um,
Totally.
let's see. So the next question that I want to ask you, is, if you were to say hello to your own grief today, what would you say to it?
Mm. Well, I would say most of the grief that I've had in my life has been over particular relationships. And so I think that the way that that grief manifests itself is by trying to take a lot of those lessons that I was not able to learn in previous relationships and try to sort of pay it forward to the new relationships that I have in my life.
So you're like saying, take that. Like I've moved on, and this is what I'm
Yeah.
I'm doing now.
Yeah, I mean, I
Um,
just last year broke up with my ex of like 7.5 years, and we're still
mhm.
really good friends. So I will often text them and be like, "Yep, this new person I'm dating is also a slow walker." So, because I was the slow walker in that relationship, and then I'm like, it's all atonement. It's all atonement.
It comes back
Yeah,
in different forms.
totally.
All right. Well, thank you for having fun with those questions. Thank you for just giving us all your knowledge, and I'm sure you have so much more to give to others. Where can people say hello to you, and where can they find you? And I'll also be putting these in the podcast description as well.
Yeah, so I'm at the Death Designer on all of my platforms. I'm most active on Instagram, and you can also check out my website. But that is where all of my business stuff is. And then if you also want to check out the work that the National Home Funeral Alliance has been doing, um, if you just Google National Home Funeral Alliance, you can find our website that way. And we have the two most helpful resources that people might want to check out are that guidebook that we just published this year. That's going to be on the homepage. And then we also have a list of state requirements for people who are considering doing a home funeral in their state.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll have to make sure I snag those resources as well, and add those to my page as well. So thank you for that. All such good, helpful tips, so much education. that you've given. As I close out today, if grief has taught me anything, it is that time is our most valuable resource. So thank you for giving your time today. Thank you for taking the time to say hello to grief today. There are so many people in this world grieving someone or something, and it's not my goal to reach every single one of them. It's simply to reach one. And I hope that person is you. I hope you took at least one thing, and I know there was plenty more to take from this session, from this podcast today, that helps you on your own journey. So take time to say hello to your grief, and better yet, say hello to someone else, because you never know who you will be greeting in their grief. I would love to say hello to you. So please follow me at Hello I'm Grieving on Instagram or any other social media platform, on YouTube, on Facebook, all the above. And also check out my website at helloimgrieving.com. So until next time, I look forward to saying hello.